So we have a couple of just overview topics. Everybody does family history research for a different reason, and it's good to have an idea of what you're actually trying to figure out. So is your goal to find long-lost cousins? Are you trying to find records from Italy? Are you trying to create a tree with the names of all of your ancestors? Do you want to know where they came from? A lot of these questions really overlap and would involve similar techniques. But again, it's a good idea to actually have a solid idea of what your goal is. A lot of people just kind of start typing in names and adding things without really knowing what they want to do. And it's really good to focus yourself with a certain research question. If you were in the professional genealogy world, they'd really want to winnow that down even further, and they would say, you have to research a very, very, very specific question at one time. Who are the parents of so-and-so born in so-and-so? I'm willing to let us be a little bit more broad than that, but basically we should be focused, and whatever we define focused as, we should be focused. So we're lucky as Italians because we're able to do a lot of what we want to do from home. Now, I don't want to say that you can do everything from home, but the vast majority of what we want to look up, we can fortunately do either from our home or from libraries on Long Island. And there are a bunch of different sources that we can use to do this research. I'm sure we've all heard of Ancestry.com, which is the largest website. Family Search is the other main website, which is the history arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who've published a lot of information. And then for Italian records, we also have the Antonati Portal, which is a separate website created in a partnership between Family Search and the Italian State Archives, which has very similar records from Italy, all of which I will get into. So, at the most basic level, we have Ancestry.com. I'm sure this is a very familiar screen. We have Family Search. Again, hopefully we've all been here before. And both of these websites have a lot of overlapping documents, whereas sometimes they only have they might have unique documents. So you have to learn to know what is where. So as I was saying before, the census is taken every 10 years. They become public after 72 years. And it has something about everybody in theory. So in 1940, we can find a census. And 10 years before that, another census. 10 years before that, another census. And these really go back to 1790. The ones for the first 60 or so years aren't too useful because they only counted the name of the head of household. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that nobody's family was here before 1850 if you're at least Italian. So we don't have to worry about it too much. So most Italians came to America after 1880. The influx of immigration really started after unification of Italy in 1861, and it builds up the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Now, the 1890 census was destroyed in a fire, so we have no 1890 census. There are fragments, a couple of pages here and there, but nothing from the New York area as far as I know. So essentially, that is gone. However, the remaining enumeration, so 80, 1900, 10, 20, 30, 40, all have a lot of information about where our family lived, what they did, who was in the household, when they immigrated, when they naturalized, lots of information like that. Every census asks different questions, so you have to know what's going to be asked in each census to figure out which one you need to find to answer your particular question. So everyone would have asked for, at a minimum, the name, the age, the sex, the relationship to head of household, the occupation, marital status, race, place of birth. However, in 1900, we get the month and year of birth. In 1910, we get the age at first marriage. 1900 to 1930, it'll talk about where your parents were born. It'll only give a country, I should say. So if we're born in Italy, then it'll say Italy. But it will ask for immigration year, naturalization status, so if you're an alien, if you're naturalized, if you have submitted your first papers, which mean that you've began the application to become a citizen but are not yet a citizen. And these questions are going to appear in these particular census rolls. Now, what would happen was somebody would go to every household and they would ask questions to whoever was home. So sometimes they may have walked in the door and your entire family was having dinner and they all answered the questions. Sometimes the family may have been at work and they asked the neighbor. We don't really know who was answering these questions until 1940. In 1940, they started marking it with an X to say this person was the respondent. For every other census, we can only really assume the bearer, the giver of information. And it really could have been the neighbor. Sometimes these forms were transcribed multiple times from a sheet to a ledger to this. So we have to be aware that there's a lot of a lot of ways in which these records could be wrong. So the basic structure will be correct. There'll be names, and generally speaking, everything will make sense. But we do have to realize that things sometimes will be very wonky, and it will not make any sense. So this is an example of a census from 1900. Again, I just want to get a vague sense. Who here uses the census regularly? Okay, many people don't. Good. So this is 1900. They're all going to look something like this. The shape changes a little bit every decade, but it's a ledger format with every single name being on one line. So the top line will be the head of the household. It'll say information about them going across, and then each household will be enumerated in order. Again, we have 1940. So we have every single household on the block is listed consecutively, more or less. They would go down the streets. In 1940, they actually asked some supplementary questions at the bottom to two people randomly on the page. Line 44 and line 79 got supplementary questions. But this is the basic form of the census. And we could do an entire lecture on using the census, but we want to move on a little bit more than that. Especially because the census is not too useful to get yourself back to Italy, which is kind of the goal of everybody doing Italian genealogy. If you come from other countries, if you came a long time ago, finding your place of origin is difficult because records from the 19th and 18th centuries don't often give specific places of birth. But we're lucky. Because Italians came much later, it's relatively easy to figure out from where you came. As I showed here, the census doesn't really say that information. So it gives a place of birth. So it might say New York, it might say Italy. But unless your question is, am I Italian? And the answer would be, yes, I'm born in Italy, or no, I'm born in Germany. The census will not help you too much. So to find the birth in Italy, we have to use other things. But the census can be a good first step to figure out exactly where we're living. Now, chances are we already have a vague sense of where our families were living in the 1900s. It was probably New York City if we're all here. So on some level, you could almost even skip the census. Now, don't do that because it's a good place to start. But in theory, the census will not be too useful. So in a rough order of utility, there are various ways to figure out where your Italians came from. The best source is the passenger list, so the actual immigration record into either Ellis Island or another port. You can use naturalization and citizenship records, and of course I'll be going through all of this more. But you can use draft records, social security records. We have vital records, so birth, marriage, and death records. These are not too useful. On occasion you will find a town of birth listed on them. And even children's birth records on occasion might give a hint as to where their parents were from. So passenger lists. Surviving passenger lists for the Port of New York start in 1820. They go to 1957. More recent records do exist. They're on terrible quality microfilm at the National Archives. They're trying to be digitized. They're not too useful. We probably didn't come that late anyway. If you did come that late, there's much better records that you could get more easily that have far more information anyway. But again, assuming that we are coming in the early 1900s, the passenger list is our best bet. Now, the passenger list was the official record of arrival until 1924. Again, I'm going to ask, anybody know that their family came after 24? Good, what I figured. So in starting in 1924, the official record of arrival becomes the visa. And there's a separate visa file, which is actually far more information-rich than the passenger manifest. But I suspected that it wouldn't necessarily pertain to our direct ancestors. Now, maybe we don't know the exact year, so I'm going to still talk about it later. We could have had other relatives that came after 1924. I'm sure somewhere in our family trees, some relative did come after that year. But for the most part, our Italians didn't. So, also, I should add that arrival records are also restricted for 50 years. So these ones that are from the 60s and 50s that are on the bad microfilm are going to be digitized slowly and put online as they pass the 50-year window. But again, we really shouldn't concern ourselves too much. So Ancestry and Family Search both have a searchable database of these New York City passenger lists. Now, I should also add that Ancestry.com is a subscription service. Costs $50 for 6 months, $100 for 6 months, depending on the sale and the deal and the plan you get. Family Search is entirely free. It is a nonprofit. Each one has different strengths and weaknesses, which I do in a whole separate lecture. But If you're doing this work seriously, it is fairly necessary to subscribe to Ancestry. You don't technically have to. You have almost all the records you need from Family Search. It's generally worth getting subscriptions in at least a small bundle. You can subscribe to Ancestry for a month, for 3 months. Because they've both indexed things differently, there is a value to having both, access to both, especially for records like this. So the passenger lists are often very hard to read. They were microfilmed with a terrible microfilming vendor in the 30s, 40s, whenever they did it. And the original records were actually sold for $1,000 of pulp. So there are no extant paper Ellis Island arrival records. The only records that exist are the terrible microfilm. So all the more reason why different sources of reading them, different indexes, are more useful. Okay, so the records that predate Ellis Island are somewhat incomplete. Ellis Island wasn't always the arrival processing facility. It's not where everybody went. Again, wouldn't concern Italians too much, but up until the 1850s, they were just let off the boat. They walked off, and that was that. Starting in the 1850s to the 1890s, the processing center was called Castle Garden. It was at the Battery, and there was some degree of processing there. Starting in 1892, they opened up Ellis Island, which is the island that we all know today, and record keeping vastly improved. Now, the records up until 1897 aren't as great as the later ones because there was a fire, so we lost the better quality ones. These are more bare bones. Starting in 1898, we have the passenger lists that are a little bit more detailed. Up until 1906, they are 1 page of information. After 1906, they become 2 pages. And sometime in the 30s, I guess, they actually go back down to 1 page and become less useful because they're no longer the official record of arrival. So most of our family would have come in this period where we have these information-rich records. So the earlier passenger lists, and Italians certainly came at this time, they would only ask for the name, the age, occupation, country of origin, and destination, like this. So this is my great-great-grandfather, Giuseppe's arrival record. He's numbered 1 on top. And we have Giuseppe Mondello, age 27, a male, a laborer, born in Italy, bound for Boston. And then on the right, it talks about his luggage. He has 2 something or others. These are useful to document an arrival into these states, but unfortunately it's hard to really determine who is who because the information is so bare. How many Giuseppe Mondellos, age 27, in 1896 were there? It's a good question. So we can look at other records to see if we can find other people with the same name. You know, if we, let's say, go into the census and see in 1900 how many Giuseppe Mondellos were living in the country. Were there 100? Were there 2? We can ballpark. But unfortunately, there's really not a lot we can do to determine exactly who a person is on one of these lists because really all we have to work with is the name and the age. So this is a record from 1902. It's a little bit longer. We see more fields. So we'll have not only their name and their age and their marital status, we'll get occupation if they're literate, but more importantly, we will get their specific last residence. Now, this is the first time we actually get something that's going to link us to a town in one of these records, unless there's a weird thing. I will say, this is a bit of a generalized statement for everything I say here. There'll always be an exception. You'll find a passenger list from 1893, and for some reason, that particular form said, what town did you live in? And it'll be a specific town. Not generally the case, but in 1898, we will get that by default. So it'll give you a specific town of last residence. Now, of course, the next step is to read the town of last residence, which is a whole separate problem. And it'll say who you're going to in America. So it'll give a name and an address and usually a relationship. So if we know that, you know, the patriarch of the family was Giovan Battista Mondello, and they were all going to Giovan Battista Mondello at 330 Cherry Street, and it says going to Brother Giovan Battista Mondello at 330 Cherry Street, we can use that to be able to figure out, yes, this is our correct person. Or we could say, no, it's not the correct person. Often we may not know who the person they're going to is. It doesn't mean it's not our person. Sometimes they'd be going to friends or distant cousins. There may have been one person who came over from this town first, and everybody just goes to that same person from the town. So if you don't recognize the contact in America, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just requires further research. Also about the town of last residence, you know, the information is only as accurate as what the applicant, as what the passenger provided. So things are sometimes wrong. They could be, sometimes they might give a particular neighborhood. In Italy we have frazione, which is like a borough. So they could give the borough instead of the municipality's name, which makes it harder to find. Again, these records are 120 years old, so we have to be prepared for differences. But generally speaking, it'll give the town you live in. So now, starting in the later 1900s, we get much more in-depth forms. So this is 1906 and on. So not only will it say who you're going to in America, it says who you're coming from in wherever you came from. So I might say, my mother, Carmina Varallo, in this town. And maybe it'll even be a street, an address in Italy, something. It'll say if you come to America before. It'll give some basic health information. It'll be a physical description, your eye color, your height. Not only does it give a town of residence, it gives your town of birth. Now, for Italians, that's often the same place. We didn't move a whole lot in Italy. But often people will have moved. They may have married a woman from 3 towns over, so they're living in the town where the bride is from, so it'll say that for the residents. But they were born 3 towns away, and it'll give the town of birth over there. So you do need to pay attention to both. Again, this is 1906 and later. And there's about 26 or so different, 23, 26 different questions they asked. So there's a little bit more than this, but that's the gist. So this is 2 pages. Again, we're seeing lots of fun handwriting. So they're not bad to read if you know what you're looking at, but often these were indexed by people 20 years ago, outsourced overseas. So when somebody tries to type into a computer database, that way you can type in and search for Vincenzo Focarino, who knows how they transcribe that, which is why finding these records is often difficult. Now, there actually were original book indexes that were made to these records 100 years ago, where they tried to alphabetize some of these lists. I don't get into that in this lecture because they're very complicated to use. There's not just a simple alphabetized list from the 1900s. There's 10 or 15 different books that were created in different sources that catalog different arrivals. This book is 1897 to 1902 arrivals in New York, and this book is this. They're on Family Search. So if you really wanted to play, or ask me later, we could discuss the other indexes that exist. In my experience, 90% of the time it's worth it to just play around with the database searches. If you know what you're doing, you can usually find it that way. However, there are technically other ways to get in. So, reading across, we have Vincenzo Focarino. His occupation is a laborer. He's age 16. He's male. He cannot read or write. He's from Italy. His race is Italian. His race is actually listed as Southern Italian, which is usually what you see for Italians. They consider Southern Italians to be a separate race or people. It gives the last permanent residence. This isn't my relative, so I have no idea what that says, but Godriaco, something like that. I'm not even sure who. One of my relatives is on this page. I have no idea who. Somebody. And then it says who he's going to in America, so his father Vincenzo. He's going to Chicago. On the second page, it asks the same questions about if you've been to the U.S. before. He's going from his brother-in-law, and then it lists his place of birth again as Sicily, as the country. Again, sometimes things get a little bit wonky, but that's useful for us because we know he's Sicilian now. And then it gives the comune in Italy, or some sort of municipality or village or something. So it says something like Godiano. We can play around and probably find it in a few minutes. I don't know offhand. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the stories about being detained on Ellis Island and those kinds of things. So what happened was in 1923, we passed the Quota Act, which is actually the same round of legislation. There was various laws that were passed in that period. It's the same sentiment that caused the creation of the visa records, which I mentioned before. So in 1923, we started creating quotas, which was essentially a move to prevent Southern and Eastern Europeans from coming into the country. So the law required that we only admit immigrants into the country in proportion with the ethnic breakdown that had been present as of the 1890 census. So if the country was 2% Italian and 98% Anglo-Saxon, just for demonstrative purposes, 98% of the admittances would be Anglo-Saxons and 2% would be Italians. And of course, the real breakdown was much more complicated because there were 100 different countries that were all being calculated. But essentially, they would make these visas available in proportion to how the ethnic breakdown had been from the 1890s. which was conveniently the year before all the Italians and the Jews started coming to America, among other people. So before 1923, there really weren't many reasons that you wouldn't be allowed in. There was an inspection. They would include information. They would inspect your eyes for certain illnesses. There were reasons that you could be turned away. I've certainly researched many people who have been turned away. But the imagery that we have of people being detained often comes from the quota period, where we had a lot more issues going in. So like my great-great-grandparents tried to come in. They were there on Ellis Island for 2 weeks waiting for their quota issues to be dealt with. However, what we have before the quotas and after are the record of aliens held for special inquiry. And this is a document that's included with the passenger manifests. It's on the same microfilm. It'll be indexed together. In fact, when you do a search, it'll all come up as one result. Until you open up the image, you won't even know that this is not the actual manifest. But notice that it looks very different. They're often typewritten, not always. And these, I'm not sure if I don't know exactly what year they start, but early 1900s, they start into the 20s and 30s, and everybody that was detained. Now, often people who got detained were not really there for a long time, which is why the whole Ellis Island detaining thing wasn't that big of a deal. If you go read these lists, most people have the comment LPC, which has come up in politics recently, which we're going to skip right past, but it stands for a likely public charge, and people were detained if they were believed to not be able to support themselves. Now, often what would happen was they would arrive, they'd have $2 in their pocket. The immigration officials would say, we're not going to let you in because we think you're going to be a ward of the state. They would say, oh no, my brother-in-law Marco is down the street, he's going to come help me. And they find Marco, he comes to the pier, he says, yeah, I'm Marco, and then they go on their merry way. So if you read these forms, it'll list in these columns how many days they were there for. Often it's 12 hours or 2 days or something fairly minimal. But there is still a record of them. Now, people who are actually in danger of being deported had a much lengthier process. And again, this dates back to before the quotas as well. And if you were deemed to be unfit for entry, they would try to deport you. There'd be a whole panel. You'd have to make your case. 3 judges would decide. You could appeal it to Washington. These records are fantastic, except they were destroyed. So you're not going to find them. Other ports of arrival do have records. Philadelphia, I believe, is on Ancestry. There's all ledgers. New York's board. So the official term is the Board of Special Inquiry. If you see a little note on a passenger list that says SI on the left-hand column, it stands for Special Inquiry, and it means they were detained to determine if they were eligible for entry. As a very down the rabbit hole aside, if you appealed your case to Washington, those records went to Washington and weren't destroyed. So about a month ago for a client, I was able to actually get the appeal file because they had been deemed unfit, were supposed to be deported, appealed to D.C., all the casework was sent to the Washington, D.C. central offices, and it made its way to the National Archives. So I got a whole 17-page file about the person, the transcripts of the hearings, how the son was pleading the case, and it was amazing. That would exist for a lot of detained people, except they were destroyed. Again, for New York. Most of us probably came in through New York, but we should not assume that. I had relatives that came in through lots of ports. Us being New Yorkers whose family was probably in New York City, we probably did come through New York. But the passenger lists for all the ports are online, and we do have to realize that it's not necessarily the case. So, correcting myths. This is, if you learn one thing from this lecture, have it be this slide. Memorize this slide, photograph this slide. I should have printed out this slide and given it to everybody as they walked in. Nobody's name was changed at Ellis Island. If you want to repeat it, like really, just anything to learn this one fact. So, one thing that drives genealogists crazy is the myth that people's names were changed at Ellis Island. And I have no idea where this story came from. It's been repeated as fact for 100 years. So I don't blame you if you don't know this is a myth, because everybody acts as if it's true, but it is not. So these records were created at the port of embarkation. What would happen was you'd fill out your form to buy the ticket. It would ask these questions. Clerks in Southampton or Rome or wherever you boarded the ship, who worked for the shipping company, would then type or write all the information you provided on this form on these ledgers. The ledger itself went on the ship, crossed the sea, it arrived in New York, The immigration inspectors would then have these lists and read off of them. There was no mechanism by which anybody could have changed anybody's name. If you, the immigrant, said, oh yeah, my name is Joe Smith in Italy, and they wrote down Joe Smith, that could have been. It honestly didn't happen a lot. Usually people's arrival names on this record are their original name. It's incredibly rare that it's not. I can't think of a case offhand, let alone with an Italian. But this was provided by the immigrant in Europe. And then the immigration officers simply read the forms. So I imagine there was a lot of nativism at the time. There was pressure societally to change your name to become American. It may have even been mean immigration officers that didn't treat Italians well. But there was no official or unofficial name change. And these stories are pervasive. Yes?
My grandfather on the other side came from Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, and was told, we were told that they said, your name's too difficult to pronounce, and they changed it to something else, so I had no idea what that name.
Right, that story gets told a lot. I had an uncle who, the grandson insisted that he was given the birthday of March 17th by an Irish immigration officer. Now, first of all, it doesn't ask for a date of birth on here. It asked for a date of birth decades later, but he came in 1905. There was no date of birth field. I get his birth record from Ukraine. Guess what his birthday was? March 17, 1891. So unless the Irish immigration officer went back to Galicia and forged birth records, his birthday just happened to be St. Patrick's Day. So these stories happen all the time. I think what happened was, in the 50 years between coming and telling the story, it's gotten romanticized. Instead of people changing their names, the name got changed to they changed my name. The actual active actor in the changing has gotten morphed. Now, people did go about changing the names legally and sometimes just unofficially. In New York State, there's not really much of a legal requirement to officially change your name even today. As long as you're using your name in good faith, you can really use whatever you want. Again, it gets into the weeds of current laws. But there are name change records that exist. I was just saying to my friend yesterday that I want to do a whole lecture on name changes because there's so many different ways that name changes were done. Again, no time today. But people would often change the name legally through when they naturalized. You could actually petition the court separately to change your name. If you just changed your name because you felt like it, that was also pretty valid. But the passenger arrival record would have the original name, which is a problem for people who changed their name and didn't really leave a trace of it. This is more of a problem for Jews. I would say I do a lot of Jewish genealogy research. Often they had some crazy unpronounceable name that was changed without a trace. Italians, it's not as bad. Certainly Italians changed their name. Varallo became Varal. But it's not, usually not too crazy where finding the original name is impossible. Okay, so yeah, nobody changed their name. Just learn that one fact, please. So, in addition to Ancestry and Family Search, there's another way to get to these records through the Steve Morse search engine. Steve Morse was one of the pioneers of the internet back in the 80s, and he's also a genealogist. And he created all of these really cool one-step search features. And in addition to 30 different fun databases, one of them is a one-step Ellis Island search directory. And in my experience, the way that the names are spelled in this database are often better. The searches are more flexible. You could search with less required characters. You could search, it's a cleaner format. So it's Steve Morse. I always forget if it's .com or .org, but Steve Morse Genealogy. You'll find it. But also, Steve Morse, he lives on Lombard Street, which is that crazy street in San Francisco that's the craziness. But it's a block before the craziness, so it's just a regular street. So anyway, the Steve Morse search engine is one of my preferred ways. However, I would find different things everywhere. Steve Morse's search engine links directly into the Ellis Island website, which then prompts you to buy the image. So then if I want to download the image, I have to then find the record. Once I have the image, I have to find it. And it's a whole pain. Again, I don't want to get too into the weeds of the tech support of navigating the pages, or else we wouldn't get anything done. So just some brief tips. These are Italian specific. People who transcribe the records, as I said, are not necessarily trained in what they're doing. So often you'll find lots of fun errors. The handwriting is sloppy. The dots and the T's on the letters may be a little weird. So Giuseppe may be transcribed as Giuseppe because the I was a little bit over and he doesn't know how to spell the name when it was, the transcriber didn't know how to spell the name. They may have, there may have been parts, markings that faded away. So Giuffrida became Giuffrioa because the little top part of the D disappeared. My personal favorite is that often what will happen is they'll have the parents that will have Giuseppe Mondello, Giuseppe Giuffrida, and then it'll say Antonio Figlio, Giovan Battista Figlio. Figlio means son in Italian. They will write son in the surname field to indicate that it's a son. The guy in India who's transcribing this in 2006 didn't know that Figlio means son in Italian. He thought the guy's last name was Figlio. So I've seen Ancestry transcribe results as Antonio Figlio. So if you're searching for Mondello or Giuffrida, never in a million years would you find it. Or there'll be abbreviations. So Giovan Battista is a long name. I recommend that you do not name your children Giovan Battista. It's John the Baptist. It could be abbreviated GBAT. So you may have some crazy abbreviation. If you're typing in longer names, Ancestry may not recognize that GBAT is Giovan Battista. And there are so many ways these records could be butchered that I could never even begin to explain all the tragedies you'll come across. Possibly the biggest thing to know, though, is that women in Italy did not and continued to not have a concept of a married name. Their maiden name is their name. They don't call it a maiden name. That's just their cognome, a surname. So if you are born Giuffrida, you will die Giuffrida. Now, in America, they almost always, I can't think of a time that they didn't take their husband's name. But the arrival record, because it's been created at the port of embarkation, is before they've Americanized, it'll usually have the wife's maiden name. Now, if they're traveling together, this will be apparent because we'll have Giuseppe Mondello with his wife, Giuseppe Giuffrida, which actually I should also add, if it doesn't say Figlio for the children, they may transcribe the children's surnames as the wife's surname because there's little hash marks. And the hash mark's really tied to Mondello, but that's not clear in the form because the immediately preceding surname would be the wife's maiden name because they're listed father, husband, wife, children, children, children. So you have to be prepared for a lot of flexibility. I had one more point about maiden names. I don't know what it was. Okay, so right, the next thing would be that often people in Italy had little pet names or diminutive forms. So in Sicily, for example, the name Antonio was not usually used. They were usually named Antonino. So a little extra blip. And various names could have little Giuseppinas, little thises, little that's, and there may be weird endings to the names to be aware of too. The handwriting is deplorable, requires flexibility. If there's one second takeaway is the power of the wildcard search. Now, every platform has a different way of doing this, but generally in most databases, you can use an asterisk to represent multiple unknown characters. So if you're searching for, let's say, Mondello, you could use the asterisk to represent any number of letters and a question mark to represent specifically one letter. So often when I'm doing a search for somebody, I might just get rid of all the vowels. And I'll try to think about what consonant sounds would be the most clear in a language barriered translation. So I would assume the M would get across to whoever's writing the information down, and probably the D and maybe the L. So I would probably, if I were just searching this, I might do M asterisk L asterisk, M, N, L, and I would let there be any unknown quantity of characters in between. And that would be, the search results would, of course, vary widely because there'd be any M, N, L consonant sound, but hopefully you'll be able to find your results amongst the mess. And again, a question mark could be specifically one letter. So like actually in the case of this, I might do M question mark N, because it's probably not going to be 5 letters between the M and the N, even if it's mistranscribed or miswritten. It might just be, it might say Mendello, or Mandello, or Mindello, or Moondello. Okay, so in Sicilian, there's often lots of U sounds. Now, this surname is not going to be in dialect, but there often could be a U sound in a Sicilian word that got in there somehow, because that's how they speak. Now, again, I've never specifically seen Mondello written Moondello, but it could have happened. So the wildcards allow you to factor in all these errors. It's not just vowels that are going to be wrong, of course, so you have to play around. I might do an M wildcard N anything search. So M asterisk N asterisk. And there'll be any record in that fits that bill. You could also leave fields blank. So if you're dealing with the Figlio, oh, I know what I was going to say before, sorry. what I was going to say about the, actually no, I said it. It was that often the children will have the wife's surname because it's written. Okay. But so what you can do is leave the fields blank. So you could search by just the first name, which could be difficult. But let's say you know that your ancestor arrived on the Carpathia in 1911. Let's say that's your family story. You could search for every single Marco to arrive on the Carpathia in 1911 and put an age range there. And there might be 100 people. But you could scroll through those 100 names in 30 seconds probably. And even if the surname is going to be really butchered, if you just scroll through the list, you can easily tell what a computer can't. The amount of times that I've spent an hour trying to find a record, only to realize that the transcription error was something incredibly stupid. You know, if I'm searching for a Chait family, and it's spelled with a K instead of a C, and the computer just didn't pick that up, but when I see that it's, you know, K-H-A-I-T instead of C-H-A-I-T, it's obvious to you immediately that it's supposed to be Chait. So there could be reasons like that. So you could always search by only a last name, only a first name. You could, you know, every website allows you different fields by which you can search. In the lecture I was saying that I give before about the differences between ancestry and family search, I go into this in more detail. But every website lets you search different things. Take advantage of that. Okay. Search by fields that are less likely to be misspelled. So if a first name is fairly simple, like Giovanni, that's probably not going to be mistranscribed. Now, it, I'm sure, is many times, but Giuseppe or Giovanni is a lot easier to read than some of these really long, crazy Italian names. If your last name is Silipini, with all the L's and the loops and the I's, there's a million different ways that some outsourced researcher in India might have transcribed Silipini. If the name is Giovanni, there's at least a better chance of it being right. So you have to think about what may have been done improperly by the indexer, in addition to what could have been wrong 100 years ago. You could search by fields that are easier to read as well, so you could just constrain your search for only people whose last residence was Italy. If it says Italy, it's not going to be misspelled, it's not going to be mistranscribed as China. So generally, Italy will be Italy and it'll be transcribed as Italy, unless it's not. You could search for years that you know your immigrant arrived. So if you have him on the 1910 census and you have his marriage from 1905, but you know that he wasn't there in 1900 because whatever, it's not the 1900 census, we'll say, you can only search for those 5 years. So you have to realize that you can search by lots of different things besides just a name. However, be careful of false assumptions. So let's say he's in the 1910 census, and he says in that census that he arrived in 1902. As we discussed before, that information could have come from any source. If you were at work and your neighbor said to a stranger what year you had arrived in America, how accurate would he be? Keeping in mind that these are people often illiterate, they don't speak the language, so add in the language barriers, and it's really a crapshoot when you're trying to get some of these information correct. Even if your immigrant himself was answering the questions, he may likely have not known the year he arrived, if he came 20 years ago. I've seen records where they're actually definitely written by the applicant and the immigrant. And you know, it says, when did you arrive? I don't know. What ship did you arrive on? I don't know. So people often didn't know this about themselves, let alone about strangers who they may have been answering questions for. So if your ancestor is in the census, it's a fairly safe assumption that he's here. Even that isn't necessarily the case. Just yesterday in Utah at my class, we did a whole case study about somebody who had a 1928 tombstone and was alive in the 1930 census. And the guy spent 3 days in an unventilated warehouse in East Texas going through tax records to figure out when the guy died. And it turned out he died after 1930. The tombstone was just wrong. But conflicting evidence will happen all of the time. If the neighbor is just answering questions, you know, things could have happened. Maybe the husband went back to Italy. That happened a lot. Might be the next slide, actually. It is the next slide. How about that? So often people went back to Italy. So this is really long for demonstrative purposes. I once traced a family where there were 2 parents and about 7 kids. I think I'd found 14 different transatlantic crossings between the immediate family. 2 came over, 1 came back, 3 came over, 1 came back, 5 came over, 2 went back. And This is a specific Italian tendency. They were called birds of passage. And Italians would very often go back and forth. So in 1910, maybe Grandpa Marco went back to Naples for the summer, and then the enumerator was asking the downstairs neighbor, oh yeah, who lives there? Oh yeah, Marco lives there, because the neighbor didn't realize that Marco went back to Italy 3 days earlier. So the census is not perfect. Nothing is perfect. Genealogy is terrible on some level. So everything is hard. So naturalization records. So many immigrants, upon living in the U.S. for a few years, decided to become citizens. And they would do this by petitioning a court. Now, traditionally, any court of record with a clerk and a seal could naturalize. Which means if you're naturalizing in 1830, it's very difficult to find the record because it can be anywhere and anything. Luckily, in 1906, the federal government standardized this process. There were standardized forms, there were duplicate copies, everything was very regimented. Most of our ancestors probably naturalized after 1906. I'm sure some did it just before, but for the most part, we're looking at this later period. If you had, and again, the laws would change, but basically after about 5 years, you were eligible to naturalize. So if you came after 1901 or 1900, you're probably in this easier to find era. And these later records after 1906 are amazing what they have. The earlier ones, not so much. So what would happen was the immigrant would first file a declaration of intention in court, usually where they lived. And this actually could be filled out really as soon as you arrived. So you'd fill this out, it would ask some questions about you. After a waiting period, you then file your petition of naturalization, usually in the same court, not always. And then a judge would either accept or not accept this petition, and if he accepted it, you became a U.S. citizen. So now this is an older record from 1906, just before the law changed. And we have a little certificate from Brooklyn that Giuseppe Vicino became a citizen of the U.S. All it does is say his date of the hearing, his name, his age, his occupation. He's making pianos. That's fun. And his address at Grand Avenue in Brooklyn. This is the other form of the actual petition. It's hard to read, but really it just has his name, his occupation. Sometimes these earlier forms from the 1890s, early 1900s may give a date of birth. On occasion, I've seen a town of birth, but they're fairly bare bones. After 1906, it gets a lot better. So it's going to say where you're born, when you arrived, on what ship you came, who you're married to. Even later records will say the date you got married, where your wife is from, when your wife naturalized, husband. They'll all ask for occupation, where you live, your children's names, when they were born. Sometimes you get pictures. So here we have a declaration from, when is it? From 1923. This is probably what 90% of our records would look like, more or less, because they're pretty much the same in the teens, 20s, that period. So Joseph DeFabio is age 28. So it gives occupation as a shoemaker. It gives a brief description of him, his hair color, his eye color, his height, his weight. It'll say where he's born, so Ribobatoni, I believe that's in Molise. And gives his date of birth as 1895, August 9th. It'll ask when you arrived and on what ship. So we arrived on the Caserta, and it'll give a date somewhere on the 8th of January, 1920. So this information is supplied by the applicant. It is roughly correct, not necessarily correct. As I said, people didn't always know the information. And at the bottom, there's a fun certification that he is not an anarchist, he's not a polygamist, he is not a believer in polygamy, and it is his intention in good faith to become a citizen of the U.S. of America and to permanently reside therein, so help him God. So that's fun. This is the petition, so I really should have blown this up for you, I'm sorry. But on top, it has basically the same information. Often it'll be written, it might be typed out. It's another way of, if it's hard to read the first page, maybe the second page is more legible. He had no children at the time, but if he had children, it would say who his children are. At the bottom, there'll be witnesses, and it'll give their address and occupations. They might often be friends, siblings, neighbors, nemesis, you never know. Everybody will sign it at the bottom. And then on the back page, if he's admitted, it will say he was admitted and the date. This is a more recent record, so starting in the 20s, I believe 29 or so, we get a picture on the declaration. So here we have my cousin, Anna Malika, and we have her place of birth. Again, we have all the same information, but it's a little bit easier to read. It's typewritten. Now, one thing that we get starting in 1906 is the Certificate of Arrival. And when petitioners naturalized after 1906, when the rules were all changed and things were made more formal, the courts would actually have INS, or what was previously, so briefly, USCIS is currently U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It was previously INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services. Pre-1930s, it was a bunch of different names, but basically the immigration, whatever, the agency, immigration department, whatever they were called. So the courts would then have whatever version of the immigration service was named at that time. They would actually go in and look at the passenger arrivals to find the arrival record of the person who was trying to naturalize. So if you arrived before 1906, you have to do that. But if you came after 1906, when the records were better and in theory more easy to locate, the courts would have them actually find the arrival record. So if you're naturalizing anytime after 1906 and have arrived after 1906, there will be a certificate of arrival attached with your immigration record. Whereas if there wasn't this, you could just say, oh yeah, I came on this day on this ship, and you could have been making it up. Nobody would have known. If you see this, and it'll be, on the first page of the record, usually before the declaration, it means that somebody in the 30s or whenever went into the records and actually found the arrival. So you know that Giuseppe Cordieri came at New York on September 2nd, 1913 on the Mendoza. Once, I've actually seen the wrong guy. Anybody been to Frank Pepe's, the pizza place in New Haven? So when Frank Pepe, the founder of it, naturalized, he actually naturalized claiming to be a different Frank Pepe. So the arrival record ties to a different guy named Frank Pepe. However, generally speaking, they will have found the right person. So family search and ancestry have a lot of these indexes and a lot of images of most New York area courts. Naturalization records, again, could be a whole lecture. In fact, I've been to whole lectures. Actually, there was one last week at the Italian Genealogy Group, wasn't there? Anybody who's not a member of the Italian Genealogy Group should be. If you're doing Italian research, they meet the second Saturday of every month in Bethpage. And there was just a whole lecture about naturalization records. But to put it briefly, if you're from New York and you naturalized between 1900 and 1950, your naturalization record is probably online somehow, somewhere. But finding them is very complicated because there's lots of different places one could naturalize. So at the simplest level, you could naturalize at the federal court or the state court. So if you're looking at New York City only, basically in this period, you can naturalize in the Eastern District Federal Court, which is basically Brooklyn, the Southern District Federal Court, which is Manhattan and the Bronx and that part. Queens is probably Eastern District too, but I have so few people in Queens, I'm not positive offhand. But either way, those are the two federal courts that you could naturalize in. You could also naturalize in the county courts, which are part of the state Supreme Court. So Queens County, Queens County, Kings County, Richmond County, nobody lived there, but technically they exist. Someone did, yeah, not a lot. Or New York County. If you moved out to the suburbs, you could also naturalize in Nassau County, Suffolk County. And all these courts naturalized for different years. So, for example, Kings County Supreme Court stopped naturalizing in 1924. Nassau County naturalized to the 80s. So I just got a Nassau County naturalization record of an Italian who immigrated in the 50s, naturalized in the 60s. It was $5, got it by mail. And finding these records is a little bit complicated because there's all these different places to search. Now, when you're on Ancestry, if you just type a name into Ancestry, it'll search everything in the database at first. You can constrain to certain collections, but I would say a third of the time, the record might just come up. If you're lucky, if it's an uncommon enough name, if you have enough information, if it's transcribed correctly, you may just find it because everything now at this point has been so well indexed, comparatively speaking. However, it's good to know exactly how to get to the actual origin of the records as well. So the German Genealogy Group and the Italian Genealogy Group have been indexing a lot of these records. They've been doing it for, I have no idea how long, 20 years?
20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. And they, on their website, have a database, which is just an index, which gives the petition and the volume number and all that information. Additionally, you could also search on Family Search. There are microfilmed indexes, so the actual index cards that were made to alphabetize the naturalizations in each court, those are often online on Family Search. You can go in and browse the microfilm page by page. There's a million different ways to find naturalization records. Again, we just don't have time to go into every single process. However, this book is fantastic. It is the Guide to Naturalization Records of the United States by Christina Schaefer. It's a little bit out of date. It was published in the 90s, so it's not going to reflect what's online, but it reflects what exists. So, again, in New York, it's somewhat cut and dry, but if I'm researching somebody in Cook County, Illinois, I want to figure out what records exist where, I go into the book, it's organized by state and then by county, and it'll say exactly which courts were naturalizing for which periods. It's still useful for New York City, especially because I've glossed over the earlier years. The pre-1900 courts in New York City are very complicated. Most of us probably aren't dealing with that, but this book has everything. And it says, what is it Family Search? So in the 90s, Family Search was only a library in Utah. So it says what's on microfilm. Now those microfilms have been digitized. Susan, if you want to give a spiel at the end about Family Search and Family History Centers, you're welcome to. But for those who don't know, there are family history centers throughout Long Island where you can go and also you can get help doing genealogy research and also access some records that the Mormons have, that Family Search has, which is owned by the Mormons, which are not viewable at home due to contractual restrictions with the original person who gave the records. Susan's a volunteer at the library in Plainview, and she usually loves to give a little spiel if you want to do that. We'll do it at the end. But for the most part, naturalization records are actually always open from home. So, as I said, there's not a lot of easy ways to do this concisely, but first I would just type the name into your databases and see what happens. It's not methodical, but often it comes up. But assuming you're not that lucky, what you have to then do is search the census records to figure out when your ancestor naturalized. So every record from 1900 to 1940 asked your status. So it would say either alien, papers, or naturalized. Now again, it may not be accurate, but assuming it is, or assuming it's vaguely accurate, you can get a picture of when and where your ancestor naturalized. So if you are living in Kings County between 1920 and 1930, and you're an alien in 1920 and naturalized in 1930, the first place to search for your records would be naturalizations from Kings County in the 20s. So in that period, you either have to look up or just learn that you could have been naturalized at the Kings County Supreme Court or at the Eastern District Federal Court. And again, the fun stuff, so I believe the GGG index and the IGG index, correct me if I'm wrong, does not have the Brooklyn Supreme Court naturalizations, because that was done by the Jewish Genealogical Society of New York website. So you have to go there for the index. So it's very convoluted. There are guides online that talk about some of this in greater depth. I wish I could do it all, but there's just not enough time. Every lecture I give, it's me saying I wish I had more time. We're going until 11:30, so yeah, we got to move. So if you can't find them in the immediate place, you have to go to the neighboring boroughs, counties, states. If you're looking at New York City, it's actually possible to get a hold of your ancestors' voter registration files, which I talk about in depth at my lecture in 2 weeks at the IGG and Bethpage on February 8th. Hint, hint. So voter registrations in New York City were great because you had to register every year. You fill a little ledger book, and it asked you if you were an immigrant, when and where you naturalized. So you would say, I naturalized in 1925 at the Kings County Supreme Court, or whatever. Getting these is difficult because they're not online anywhere. However, there are some indexes online. So 1924 is on Ancestry. So if you find a record in the 1924 voter index on Ancestry, you can then order the original record from the municipal archives. Again, feel free to ask me questions if you're curious, or come to my lecture in 2 weeks where I go into everything about the specifics everywhere for voter records. They're great. The other alternative, and this is the time-consuming but easy in theory way. So I mentioned briefly that in 1906 the records become federalized, and the federal government makes second sets. So there were really 3 copies. You would get one, the court would get one, and a copy was sent to the federal government. Became INS, now USCIS. So for $65, you can pay USCIS to search their exhaustive index of every naturalization that's ever occurred in America from 1906 on for your ancestor. Now, again, there's a lot of baggage here, but basically, in theory, they can find it for you. Now, often they can't find things because their indexes are terrible, just like every other index. But at least it's a terrible index of everything as opposed to our indexes, which are terrible indexes of some things, if that helps. So, as I said before, the German Genealogy Group has the U.S. District Courts for New York and New Jersey. And the county courts of Nassau, Suffolk, Queens, Bronx, and Richmond. JGSNY's website has the index for the county court of Brooklyn. Ancestry has the index for the county court of New York County. So again, that's Manhattan, New York County, those naturalizations from 1907 to 1924, period roughly, plus other things. Ancestry makes it very unclear what they have. You have to really dig into their catalog to figure out what's included because they amalgamate everything. So the collection will be New York area naturalizations, and you don't really know what's in there unless you really go through it. Now, also, some of these naturalization records are actually linked to the record on Ancestry or Family Search. So if you type in the name, it'll pull up the record. Other times it pulls up the index to the record, which means you have to actually go in and either browse microfilms on Family Search to find it, which again could be a whole lecture, or you can order it from the court. So sometimes if you're not very computer literate, the easiest solution is to just order it for a few dollars from the courthouse. Both are applicable. Okay, so USCIS. So I wrote the wrong title. So there's three branches of the Department of Homeland Security. Customs and Immigration Enforcement is not USCIS. I don't know why I said that. So there is Customs and Immigration. Okay, I know what I did. So USCIS is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. There's also Customs and Border Patrol. And then there is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Those are the three branches. I don't know what I did over there. That was wrong. So these three branches of Homeland Security all have different roles. USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration, handles what we need to deal with because they have all the records. So as I had said, they can search their index for $65 and they will tell you what they have. So the way this is very convoluted because the access to the index is restricted by law. So you don't have access to the index. You can only have them search it for you. So you pay $65. They attempt to find any reference to your ancestor in this index. And it takes about a month to hear back. Then once they find a record, you pay another $65, and they'll send you the record in 2 or 3 months. It's a good racket. Hopefully not. So, yes, again, I'm trying to summarize here. There's a proposal to raise these fees for like $600. It probably won't happen. So this is an example of the index. Now, I don't know what I'm looking at, honestly. What I think I'm looking at was that somebody on like a dot matrix kind of printout made a chronological list of all the records and then realized that's the best way to organize it, and then took a paper cutter and cut every single entry and then alphabetized it and then pasted it down together and microfilmed it. That's what I think I'm looking at. I have no idea. I see it's alphabetized, but clearly they're separate strips. So when you pay your $65, if this is your person, they're going to not find that. So it's very difficult. So briefly, the files they have, because as horrible as I've made this sound, they have amazing things. So in addition to having a copy of all the naturalization records, they have a lot of other things that are useful. So the C file is what would be the naturalization record. So when you naturalize, you were given a certificate. People have probably seen the certificates with like a pretty logo and the picture of your ancestor on it. They're called certificate files. So the courthouse never got a copy of the certificate. There were only 2 copies of those. One went to your ancestor, so maybe you still have it, and 1 copy went to USCIS. So the C file contains the petition, the declaration, the certificate, and any other correspondence that may have been included. Now these pertain, these start in 1906 when the process is federalized, and they go until 1956 when the series was closed. So if your ancestor naturalized in that 50-year span, USCIS will have a copy of all the documentation. And of course, like everything else, those are microfilmed and destroyed. So here we have a certificate that was microfilmed. That's all you get. So we have a picture of Carola, but you can't see a whole lot here. This is their copy of a petition. So the ones that are on Ancestry are from the courts. And even though they're microfilmed usually, they're still much better quality microfilm. So again, this file is of limited use, but if you can't find the record, if the court lost the record, there are ways that this can be useful. If you can't find the record, you can always pay for the index search. Then it'll tell you, oh yeah, he naturalized on this date in this place at this whatever. You can then say, oh, let me just call that courthouse and then get the record from them without paying the second $65. So there's lots of different ways into these records. I mentioned visas. Those start in 1924 as the official arrival record. After 1944, they become rolled into A files, which I'll explain in a couple of slides. And they contain all the information that would have appeared on a passenger list. And it contains a copy of the birth record, too. So there'd be vital records, police reports, lots of fun stuff. So these, again, microphone quality sometimes. But here we have I've actually never gotten a Italian visa record. This is my friend's German record, so sorry they're not Italian. But it's the same file, the same record, just more vowels in the names. So there'll be a picture, and along with the birth certificate and some other information. This is just an excerpt. So another fun record that is kind of unrelated to this would be the AR2, the Alien Registration Forms. So starting at the Second World War, the US began to record every non-naturalized alien. And for 4 years they did this, where every non-naturalized person in the US aged 14 and above filled out a form. So it asked for your name, your arrival information, when you arrived, where you were born, when you were born, your weight, your height, some biographical information. Now this is very useful if you cannot find an arrival record. If your ancestor was not naturalized in 1940, they will have an AR2, at least they should. And there they will have been asked where they were born, and where they arrived, and when they arrived, and on what ship they arrived. So this is kind of a secondary option. If you cannot find your arrival, you can go to this. If you arrive before the passenger lists become good, so you came in 1890 as a 10-year-old, and then in 1940, you're 60. You've possibly never filled out where you're from. You certainly didn't fill out when you arrived because you didn't naturalize, if you didn't naturalize, but you have it on this form. And again, to buy this form will be $130. You pay $65 for your index search, you get your number, you pay $65 more for the record. I could do a whole lecture on why USCIS is the way it is and what we're doing to change that, but again, no time. So A files. This does not necessarily relate to us directly, however, it can. So starting in 1944, the US, or INS, totally revamped how they did everything. And instead of having C files, A files, and this and that, and whatever, they created one streamlined document, the alien file, which we call an A file, which is everything pertaining to any particular arrival, any arrived person from 1944 to the present. If you immigrate today, you have an A file. If you immigrated on April 2nd, 1944, you have an A file. And everything about your immigration is in this one file. Your birth record, your marriage record sometimes, if you had married out of the country, your naturalization documents, your visas, correspondence, police reports, everything is in this one file. Now, these are useful because even if we came before 1944, if we had contact with INS in the 40s and 50s, we may also have an A file. So if you're not naturalized and you have goings on with the government, these files may exist. I've had many colleagues who've had Italians who never became citizens who had A files. I have my own great-great-grandfathers on order right now. I wish I had it so I could have included it. But I do have an example, I believe, of somebody else's. So what would happen was every immigrant was assigned an A number. And if you naturalized between 44 and 56, your A file stuff went into a C file. That's fun and easy to understand because the C file was for citizens and the A file was for aliens. So if you were becoming a citizen, they would in theory take the A stuff and put it in the C stuff. After 56, they realized that was too convoluted and they just stopped C files and put everything in the A file. I wouldn't be too concerned about the organization of these records because when you do the index search, they will tell you what they have. So because you kind of need to do the index search to get these files, knowing what they have in advance doesn't help too much, at least at the basic level. I should add that you can order a C file if you have the certificate number. So if you have your naturalization petition, on the back, when you naturalized, it would say at the bottom your C number, which is how they're cataloged with the federal government. Now, if you have your petition, you probably wouldn't order your C file because it will probably just be the same thing but a poorer copy. There could be correspondence and other stuff in there. I wouldn't just pay $65 to order it unless you had a reason to. But you could, in theory, take the C number on the back of the petition and order for the one $65 payment the C file. Likewise, for the A file and the AR2, if you happen to have your immigrant's A number, which sometimes appears on documents, you could order it without doing the index search. Again, time really blowing through this because there's just so much going on. I spent a whole week in Salt Lake City last January just basically learning about the immigration USCIS records. So I'm condensing a week into 25 minutes. So here we have an A file. So this is my friend's great-grandfather's A file, Arthur Felix Calzaretta, who changed his name to Calzareth. And this documents how we had a name change, documents how there was an illegitimacy and the name changes were different on the birth record than on the arrival record. We have a picture, gives his parents' names, his arrival information. Here's the birth record. So he was actually born with the surname Del Giudice, because his parents were not civilly married. There was a whole controversy. But the A file explained the whole situation. Now, he arrived in 1900. And my friend had been unable to find the arrival record because he didn't know this whole illegitimacy story. Because Arthur never naturalized, there was this whole big A file from the 50s, which included the birth record to explain the whole story. Now, briefly, this whole $65 thing is part of the genealogy program, which is the certain records that I've mentioned and a couple others that I didn't. There's also possibilities to get records through a regular FOIA request. So FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act, which I do a whole hour-and-a-half long lecture on. How about that? And you can actually request certain A files through the FOIA program for free. So they basically had to make an arbitrary point, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding this right now, so I can't get into it. But basically, the A number I mentioned, if your A number was below 8 million, which means any arrival from May 1st, 1951 and earlier, you're part of the genealogy program. So you have to pay all this money for the A file. If your person arrived after 1951, which is probably not most of us, but maybe you had an aunt, a cousin, a friend. If you are deceased, not you, but if the person who arrived is deceased, you can actually FOIA the A file from USCIS for free if they arrived after May 1st, 1951. And if you want to photograph this slide, this kind of summarizes everything. So the alien registrations for the non-naturalized immigrants from the 40s. The C files of any naturalization records from the 1906 to the 50s. Visa files just as a separate file from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. A files from those years if your A number is below 8 million. That is the genealogy program with the $65 search fee and the $65 record fee. And FOIA, if it's above 8 million, and these are tens of millions of files, if you are deceased, you can get this from USCIS or the National Archives. So some of these records have been transferred to Kansas City. The National Archives catalog says what they have, what they don't have. New records are going all the time. I've actually ordered multiple records that have gotten caught in the crosshairs where I've ordered one as it's being shipped, and they can't get it from me because I ordered it from USCIS, and it's on the pallet already to go to National Archives the same week. So it's very chaotic. It's kind of a loop, to say the least. And these requests also take months to process. I have about 15 or 20 A file requests through FOIA right now for people who arrived in the 50s and 60s. I've been waiting on some since November. Some say they'll be ready for me by April. Sometimes it's faster. It's very difficult. So the USCIS website has information about all of this. So you can read about the genealogy program, about FOIA. This is my grandmother's visa. So this is my grandmother's A file, who arrived in 1963. And because her A file is better quality, we have actually legible stuff, pictures. So the A file contained the visa, a police certificate, and some other stuff as well. So, and the police certificate actually attested to her good character. So there's birth records and lots of other stuff. My grandmother's still alive, so I did not include all the information, but essentially everything about her. Okay, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to discuss vital records quickly. So vital records aren't really the best way to find out where your family came from in Italy, as I said earlier. So there's a lot to learn here. Finding vital records is difficult, but it's not really in the scope of getting back to Italy. So we can go through it a little bit. But basically, every state has their own vital records jurisdiction. Now, vital records are very important for other aspects of research to figure out when people were born, when they died, where they're buried, who they married, getting parents' names. So in a much broader sense, these are super important records. New York City is unique in that it's the one non-state and territory that has its own rules and its own jurisdiction. So New York City has its own separate records and register, and it's all on their own. Most of us are probably, can I say, is anybody here not primarily New York City in terms of their research? Anybody researching another state that they need to worry about primarily? Jersey, Connecticut, something? Great. Okay. So every state has vastly different rules and policies and histories about how to get these records. Quickly, I'm on the board of directors of an organization called Reclaim the Records, and we actually are currently suing all these entities to get access to more records because we believe they're illegally withholding them. Again, I have a whole lecture about that too. I don't have one scheduled right now. I gave one 2 weeks ago in Connecticut. Passaic County, New Jersey asked me to do one in October, but then I said I have to take the bus, and they said never mind. So that may or may not happen. But Peter, is it online yet? The Reclaim the Records lecture?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Oh, the Irish group?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Where is it online?
Facebook.
Facebook. Okay. So,
It's online. YouTube.
okay, apparently it's on YouTube. But if you want to research our organization, reclaimtherecords.org, we go into all of our different cases that we've been working on. We've been suing lots of different records agencies around New York and New Jersey and across the nation to get access to more records. Again, don't have time. So in New York City, these are the records that are public. If you want access to any of these births, marriages, or deaths, they are at the Municipal Archives in downtown Manhattan. They're also on Family Search. Now, this is where I was getting at records that have to be viewed at a library. So Family Search, in the 80s, copied these records and brought them to Utah. In 2017, they digitized them all. However, due to contractual restrictions with the Municipal Archives, they can only be viewed at family history centers, which are generally LDS churches with little outposts that do genealogy research. Susan's a volunteer there. Why don't you do your spiel now? Give us 10 seconds about your...
Really, Plainview Family History Center is the only one open on the island. And we have hours from Tuesday, Thursday, Friday from 10 to 2, Saturdays 11 to 3, except the third Saturday, and there's one evening, which is Thursday evening, 7 to 9:30. And there are volunteers there, most of them are professional genealogists who will help you for free. So bring your questions, bring flash drives, bring laptops, because you can download these records to your own device for free if you come to the library.
Do you have to use the microfilm for that, or can you look at a computer on that?
No, you're looking at the actual digitized microfilm records. Now, I will say that the records at the municipal archives have been re-digitized, and they're beautiful because they're in color. So there are a lot of markings on the certificates that you don't see on the microfilm that you can see there. And, we often are dealing with very poor microfilm where you can't see barely anything on the certificate. If you go to the municipal archives who holds the original, you can read everything. But it's free, which is the real benefit. If you go to municipal archives, they'll charge you $15 for the certificate. You can look at it for free, but if you want a copy of it there, it's $15. So bring your own device or bring a flash drive. We'll show you how to use them if you don't know how to use those as well.
Where's the address again?
It's 160 Washington Avenue in Plainview. It's right near the LIE.
And it's a library?
It's part of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And the library is actually located on the left side of the building. Is the entrance.
Yes.
I'm there on Fridays.
So, again, to keep this brief, Family Search has these records online. They will probably not give a place of origin in Italy, but are incredibly useful and necessary to build back your tree. So, to figure out where your ancestor was born, married, died, these will tell you what you need. Now, later records are harder to get. So this is an example of a birth record. This is my great-grandfather from 1905. The place of births for the parents is just given as Italy. On occasion, I have seen a birth record for the parents' location for the parents' birthplace list a town in Italy. Sometimes, if the people filling out the form didn't speak English, they'd kind of go their own way. So here, actually, the midwife filled it out, and she must have spoken some degree of English. But sometimes the records themselves will be written in Italian instead of color white, it'll say Bianco. Things will actually be in Italian. The date might be written out in an Italian date. This is a marriage record from the 20s. Also, these are the digitized forms that the Municipal Archives recently did that are in color. So you'll see a microfilm example in a second, but these are a little bit clearer to read. So again, a marriage record for my great-grandparents. It says nothing about Italy because they were born in Brooklyn. So these records are necessary to get their parents' names, to learn about them. But if our question was just get back to Italy, this will not answer the question. It is a step to getting there. So to make sure that his parents are John of Virginia, to make sure we're looking at the right John of Virginia, we have to start with him. So everything has a value, but these will not give us the place of origin, usually. This is a microfilm copy of a death record. So we have my third great-grandmother from Italy. She's from Naples. Doesn't say that anywhere. It gives a place of burial, her cause of death, where she's living. Okay. The New York City births from 1910 on and deaths from 49 on are at the Department of Health. They have incredibly strict rules. Getting records is very difficult. If it's your parent or grandparent, you can get the record without issue. If it's more distant than that, getting it is annoying. On the website, they explain all the rules. I could go on and on and on. I'm suing them to have these rules rescinded, or at least my organization is suing them. It's very difficult. So ideally, your family didn't die after 1949. But if they did, it's still possible to get the record sometimes. Often, I should say, if it's a close enough relative. So this is a birth record of my grandfather from the Department of Health. Because it's my grandfather, I am eligible. Although I think for a period you weren't eligible, they changed it. So I think I had to have my dad order the record. Did you order this for me? I think you ordered it for me. It turns out my grandfather John was actually named Giovanni, which nobody knew. Now, obviously, Giovanni is the Italian form of John, but nobody knew his legal birth name was Giovanni. Here we have a death record. This is my great-great-grandmother. I believe that... No, I can't get this anymore, I don't think. No, I can... It's difficult, so they're very stringent. Okay, so marriage licenses are a separate record from marriage certificates. I know we're running a little bit over here, so I'll blow through this. So marriage licenses were created by the city clerk. These certificates that are on Family Search that I just showed you a minute ago were created by the health department. Now, the health department records what Family Search copied in the 80s. So those are the ones that are online at family history centers elsewhere. I guess not elsewhere, only family history centers. Marriage licenses were a separate document created concurrently by the clerk. Now, the health department marriage licenses ended in 1937, so there are none after them. The clerk continues to register marriages today. So for about 30 years, there's actually both. And you're supposed to register in both places. Not everybody did. So if you can't find your marriage in the certificates, it may exist in the license, or vice versa. Now, these have not yet been digitized anywhere. The only extant copy of these licenses is at the Municipal Archives at 31 Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan, which is not what oh yeah, sorry, that is correct. The marriage licenses from 50 and on are at the city clerk, also exist nowhere else, at 141 Worth Street, about a block away from the archive, not from here. And those are public after 50 years. So the ones at the Municipal Archives, they're self-serve. You walk into the reading room, you pull the microfilm, you look at it. You have to pay $11 for a copy, which is also probably illegal, but again, neither here nor there. And marriage license from 50 and on, or you're at the city clerk, you have to have them retrieve them for you. You can do it by mail at both places, but you can go in person and wait an hour, and they'll pull it for you at the clerk if it's more than 50 years old. If it's less than 50 years old, only certain entitled parties can get it. Basically you, the executive of an estate, maybe a child. So this is what it looks like. Here we have my great-grandparents. We have the certificate, not the health department certificate, but this kind of certificate that's part of the licenses record set. Here's the license. The information that the both different forms asked for was roughly the same, but somewhat different questions, different handwriting. One may be better than the other. All these records are found in different indexes. I'm going to skip over this part because it's going to be too convoluted to go through because we've hit our deadline. But basically, different indexes exist online for different record sets. So Ancestry has almost everything. Family Search has some things. The local genealogy groups, like the German genealogy group and the Italian group, have some things. But essentially, if you're looking for these records, you need to have an ancestry account. The exception to that is that the municipal archives records, so those births to 1909, deaths to 48, marriage certificates from the health department to 37, are indexed in both Ancestry and Family Search. But Family Search has a better index because it includes more information, includes parents' names, includes places of birth and addresses. Now, Ancestry actually just released a new index last week that includes some of that information, but the Family Search one is still better. So that is the gist of it. New York State records are a separate beast. Those indexes are also online on Ancestry. New York State has records, vital records that are not from New York City. And getting those is very difficult because New York State has been claimed to be so overwhelmed by getting the real ID things in order that they've actually stopped processing requests for genealogy copies. So if you need a record from outside of New York City but in New York State, you have to go to the town. And the towns each have very arbitrary rules about what they will and will not give, which is also probably against the law. So be prepared to fight. Hopefully you don't need any records from the suburbs. There are lots of legal issues at play there, poorly written regulations that essentially make giving the records discretionary. It is a bit of a catastrophe. I'm happy to answer any more specific questions later. That is basically it. I had a slide about DNA testing, so I will end with that. That Europeans often take these DNA tests, which we see on TV, with the hope of learning some insights into our ancestral origins. We often get disappointed when we don't really learn that much. Now, first of all, these are estimates, and they're only really accurate to a continental level. Often people will see, oh, I'm 2% French, I'm 6% Swedish. These are estimates that Ancestry or whichever company you're using is running based on continuously changing algorithms and sample sizes. So here we have somebody who is Jewish, not a whole lot learned here. Here we have somebody who is, on top we have somebody who is mostly British and Irish. But all these populations intermingle. So to isolate what is Irish versus English is actually rather difficult. So we have to kind of take these somewhat holistically. They become much more useful when you're somebody with a continentally mixed ethnicity. So if you have family from, say, Latin America, who's part African, part Native American, part European, then you'll see interesting results. Your ethnicity as a European is being constantly refined more and more, but it will be somewhat limited. So my results have gone from, Southern European 5 years ago to Italian/Greek to now just as Italian. And it's actually very accurate. But people report different results. Okay, I keep a case study at the end in case that I go over, but in case I don't go over, but I know I always do. So we're going to end here. I'm happy to answer any other questions. It's very difficult to give these beginning lectures because there's just so much to talk about. So really every single topic that I've picked today to discuss, every record set, could easily be an entire lecture. So thank you for bearing with me. But we have 90 minutes, so I try to give an overview of everything. Again, if you have further questions, you can always reach out to me. I have business cards. These local genealogy groups meet at the libraries in Bethpage almost every Saturday. Family History Center is open 4 or so days a week. There are lots of ways to get more specific help. Again, I'm always available to answer questions. I guess that's about all I got for you. So yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry I talk fast, but there's just so much.
Before you start answering questions,
Yes.
I brought some of the list of all the genealogy groups on Long Island at our future meetings for February, and how you can get information by joining us on Meetup, and some Italian group flyers if you don't have some with you. I have cards. Okay, so anybody can take any of these on your way out.
Yes. Actually, one second. The slides I skipped talk about Connecticut, New Jersey, other states that you said you didn't need, but that's what you missed. Yes.
I want to show you. I have a marriage certificate and I'm a widow. I was hoping that at the town hall where I paid, and by the way, this goes back to 1920. That's my mom's mom. She only lived to 20 of age, and she died of cancer. She got smoked. anyway, I'm hoping that somehow I could have gotten, when I paid for the marriage certificate, the divorce document. And this here fella at the Iceland Town Hall.
I hate Iceland. So,
No, I wasn't.
okay, so
And I had a form and I tried to ask him about everything to do, and he said because you're not officially divorced. My husband died in May 30th, 2015, leaving me as a widow. Can I go take action because I was uncontestedly divorced because I didn't have much values. I still don't have any values. And that's why he had to put it in for uncontested. Do I have any right to like navigate this?
So, I'm sorry, what record are you looking for?
I'm a survivor of my husband, right? I had to, they allowed me to pay, and then I paid. But this person at the town hall, I addressed that I would need the death certificate. The divorce certificate. When he died,
So you need your divorce certificate.
yeah,
So that, and you were divorced in Suffolk County?
records should be in the town hall.
So the divorce
they say
records,
they're there, but this man that sits there with this name, big time, and he said, "Well, I'm not giving you what it's divorced by Supreme Court." And I said, "Well, you know."
so divorce records are held at the county courts. So you'd have to go to Riverhead to get your divorce.
Oh, I had to go to the town in which I received the marriage.
Marriages are at the town, divorces are at the county.
Can you write down the county?
Sure.
See, not only is my mom's mom from the 20s, this is my parents. He died 27 years ago. She died 20 years ago. My non-biological, and then my godmother. She's 91 now. She owns her own colonial house, car, property, long-term residence in Lyndhurst. This is the Irish Uncle Smiley. He had Captain Cruises for over 46, 7 years. He go deep sea diving. The whales and sharks he get from the ocean, and he sold it to the market. That's why she has a colonial house now, and she still stands strong at 91.
Wow.
Her husband, so that's how he bought the colonial house that she resides in. And this is my only family now, here that they do.
Wow. But yeah, so you can only get your divorce. Other divorces aren't public, they're all sealed. But if you need your divorce,
Yeah, well,
you
it's
can.
a husband, me, and I should have a record of it. I have here, this is everything I have. And that's him as my widow of, and his family, big timers. This was his mom, Tekla. She was highly rich. My mom's mom, Nadesh, a rich Italian, Nadesh. My mom's mom was Nadesh. And then this is me when I got married. Sorry. Sorry. So what were you saying about this here?
So to get your divorce, you have to go to the Riverhead Supreme Court.
Oh.
So out in Riverhead, they'll help you.
Can I have the address on
I don't. I can look it up.
please?
With your phone or a camera, you can just walk through, get your
If you have a phone number,
I wrote it down.
And you said that it's not done by the town.
Right, at the county. Exactly, it's the county. They'll give it to you, don't worry.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
My father came over to Mendoza, you mentioned.
What? I'm sorry.
My father came over to Mendoza.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 1908.
That's funny.
Yeah, and I was there at the 1930 census. I was there. I had an interpreter for my mother.
Wow.
Because I'll be 97, so I remember. You know, I was 7 years old. He couldn't speak English.
You're 97?
Yeah, I'll be 97.
My
this
God.
year.
Congratulations.
So things I didn't ask my father, I should have.
I know,
at
but
the time.
hopefully with the records you can reconstruct it.
Yeah. You know, I got
difficult.
Mendoza.
That was very good. I was
Thank you.
have zero Italian, but I do have immigrants who I can't find their papers, and I did
The naturalization papers.
Their naturalization papers, and I realized, oh my God, she lived in Queens. She filed first papers, but I didn't think to look in Queens courts. I was
So the Queen's records are not digitized. So the only way to get to the Queen's records is to order it from Queens. They're actually digitizing them soon, but they're not online. So there is an index somewhere.
one of them, maybe Jewish even.
No. So the German and the Italians has.
Oh, they'll have it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can. But it'll just be the index.
Yeah, well,
So and then you can see if he's listed in there. It's in the database on the GGG group. But yeah.
she
It would
never
be.
became a citizen. She was deaf.
Oh, so she never naturalized it at all.
She filed the papers, but
Oh.
they rejected her because she was
Oh.
deaf and she never learned English.
Okay.
So, but there's first papers somewhere, and I want to figure out her parents. I have two records for her, and they have completely different parents,
So
including her own marriage record, which I assume she provided, which really blows my mind.
where was she from?
Germany.
Germany. They're usually better than the Italians.
No, they're just as messed up.
If she didn't have a petition, so now it's possible she had a petition.
She did. She filed the first papers.
No, but so the first paper is the declaration. The petition is the second document.
Yeah.
If she were rejected, she might have still filed a petition, which was then rejected by the courts, and it would still be on file.
There'll be a record somewhere.
So I would search there. It's harder to find the declaration. If there was only a declaration, I don't think the GGG indexed that. But on Family Search, there's a microfilm index of the Queens County declarations on Family Search. You have to actually browse through the films manually, but it is searchable.
That's good. I like that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
When did she die?
Early 1900s.
Okay, because in 1940 there'd be the alien registrations, but okay.
She never saw 1900s.
Oh well.
No. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
Is it the shipping list or the census? Which one has the two pages?
So it's the passenger manifest after 1906.
Okay, and that's 2 pages?
Yeah,
It is 2 pages.
from 1906 to 1920 something or other.
Okay, and census is
Just one page.
Yeah, okay, because my sister got online and she sent me a copy of, and I thought it was the shipping manifest or whatever you call it, the passenger list. And I thought that it was that one, because she said it has all this information on the bottom or something like that, and we didn't really find out that much.
If you'd brought it, I could have helped you, but yeah, I don't.
Well, I didn't know because
Yeah.
it was that my ancestors came from Poland. So the thing was, but then a friend of mine told me, she goes, even if it's from another country, Irish or whatever it is, sometimes you always learn something.
Right, exactly right. If you're coming in 19 whatever, 90% of what I was talking about is just as relevant. Maybe not the name, surname, things on passenger lists, but almost everything else is the same
She
techniques.
came in 1922.
Right, so it's all the same stuff.
So that's just it. So maybe I'll just have to take a look at that page again.
Yeah, there could be a second. There will be a second page.
So this is second.
So you can just go to the next page on the web browser.
Okay. I'll see. Maybe they either didn't make a copy of it or whatever, because she sent it to me. So we know that she came in on such a date and what ship she came in on and the name and where she came from. But then there was other stuff that you had mentioned that
Yeah,
wasn't
the place
on
of
there.
birth will be on page 2.
So it's probably
So yeah, you can find the second page.
okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Did you have a question too, or?
Yeah, I do.
Sorry.
Thank
Forget
you.
your name, I'm sorry.
Linda.
Right.
First of all, thank you. Second of all, I would love to have heard the slides that you didn't do with the ethnicity myth.
Oh, there wasn't another slide.
Oh, all right. But I had asked you about Hispanic genealogy, and you sent me the file on it. I couldn't open it. Is that on a podcast also?
You know, it's funny because Peter comes and records everything, and then I feel like they never actually get posted. So I don't really know what's happening. I can just send them to you again.
Could you? Because
I might have sent you the Pages file by mistake because I have like the Apple versions. I might have forgotten to convert it to a PDF.
Okay, I'm going to give
Just
you
give me your
my
email address again.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yeah,
because
hold
I'm
on.
going to give it to my...
Sure.